Ambassador, you've been here since what? The end of
almost 2 years.
No, almost 2 years. 2011, the end of
2011.
You came immediately after the revolution, and you came from Pakistan, from your post in Pakistan. How do you evaluate the 10 months or nearly the 11 months of Dr. Morsi's presidency?
Well, this is the first democratic government in, depending on who you talk to, and I've heard many variations of this, for thousands of years, for 50 years. So any democratic government was going to have a hard time. And when before I got here, I read some polls about the huge number of Egyptians, 85 or 90%, that thought their lives and their incomes were going to be astonishingly better under a new democratic government after the revolution. Expectations were incredibly high. So I think it would have been hard for any government to meet the expectations of the Egyptian people, very hard for any government. And yes, this government has struggled, as I think any government would have under the circumstances.
Do you think that Dr. Morsi has met the expectations of the Egyptian people?
I think that's up to the Egyptian people to decide, and they'll have to speak through the ballot box and the TV shows and other ways of communication.
When you read the recent polls, and there was a recent poll that said that if there is an election tomorrow, only 30% of the Egyptians would vote for Morsi. How do you evaluate that?
What that would evoke in my own country is that politicians would be falling all over themselves to compete with a president who was weak like that. And so you would expect to see a great outpouring of political activity to challenge Dr. Morsi and his party in the next election.
But it's also that would maybe be enthusiastic for the president or for any president to improve his strategy.
Of course, and presidents everywhere in the world are extremely sensitive to polls. And there's a great deal of discussion about this in their own political system. They watch the polls, they try and respond to the poll. Nothing is more important in the American political system than a pollster, for better or worse.
All the American presidents are stuck to the polls.
Polls,
are very important.
and the refinements of the polls in recent years. Of course, the United States is different than Egypt in that polling is a fairly nascent activity. Here in the U.S. it's enormously sophisticated and broken down very carefully by demographics. But still, I think, again, like many things in the political system, polling is developing here, and I suspect that President Morsi and his staff and his party are reading these carefully.
How do you read into the movement, the new movement of youth called Tamarrud, rebellion?
This is a grassroots movement, and of course, like all grassroots movements, it's certainly to be encouraged in a democracy. And this is a presidential system, so they, again, will have to make their views known through the ballot box and through the political system and organize political parties.
Within those 10 months or 11 months, where do you think this regime has went wrong? If we're reading within those 30%, that only 30% would elect him if there is an election tomorrow, when you evaluate, where did they go wrong?
Well, again, I'm not going to speculate on where President Morsi has gone wrong. That's really a decision that Egyptians have to.
You don't think that he went wrong in any of the decisions?
No, of course any new administration is going to go wrong. Some are going to go wrong in lots of respects, some are going to go wrong in not very many respects. There's a lot of criticism of my own president right now as he goes into his second term. You can't open a newspaper in the United States now without reading speculation about what's gone wrong with the second term. So in some respects, a lot of this is normal political dialogue. And President Morsi and his staff and his party and other parties who want to take advantage of this are going to have to watch this carefully.
You think that the constitutional declaration is a normal political dialogue? You think the Constitution was a normal political dialogue? You think that consolidating power is a normal political dialogue? Where do you think this is normal?
I think, again, that's up for Egyptians to decide. Constitutions are extraordinarily controversial in every country I've ever been in. The drafting of the Constitution, the selection of the Constitutional Convention, that participates. Even amending the Constitution in our country over the years has been extraordinarily controversial. This is part of a normal political process, and Egyptians are just going to have to sort it out.
Recently, some of the State Department's declarations or statements have expressed some concerns regarding the NGO law, regarding the demonstrations law.
And we try to speak out on those, because those go to really issues of Egypt's international obligations. The ability of NGOs to organize, and it's a fundamental element of democracy in our system, of NGOs to organize, to receive funding, transparent funding, to be clear. It has to be revealed and divulged, and to work freely in the political process. It's an absolute key part of any democracy. So yes, we're concerned about this law. We've had dozens of discussions with the government, as have other embassies and other international observers, and I think there's a process underway. They've had hundreds, they tell us, of interviews with experts on this. But yes, it's of concern. What about this? Is not new, again, not new to this administration. It was true in the previous administration too, where there were very severe restrictions on funding of NGOs.
Do you see this NGO law similar to the NGO law that was during Mubarak's era, or is it worse, is it better?
Well, there are so many versions now, it's very hard to tell what the final version is.
Absolutely.
But certainly there were very serious restrictions under the Mubarak administration, and this was a source of tension, as we saw last year, between the U.S. government and Egypt.
But I've heard from some think tanks in Washington that this is even worse.
Yes, there are certainly elements that are worse regarding foreign funding, but again, we are encouraging the government, as are many others, to move forward with a more modern NGO law.
What about the demonstration law that is being drafted and is already...
Same thing. We certainly expect and have conveyed that we want Egypt to observe international standards. There are international standards on demonstrations and basically freedom of association. We provided them our own demonstration law. We have one that regulates demonstrations in front of federal buildings in Washington. So we've provided them a great deal of information on that.
Do you think this law is a cause of concern to
This law, as drafted, does not yet meet international standards. But again, the international community is working with the Egyptian government on this in the hopes that it will meet international standards of demonstrations.
Hopefully.
And let me stress also that demonstrations, what I think is so alarming in this situation is demonstrations must be peaceful. The attack on the hotel, on the Semi-Ramis Hotel, looting, had a devastating effect on investment and tourism.
Ambassador, there is a perception within the street, the Egyptian street, and correct me if this is wrong, that Washington supports whoever sits in the chair, whoever is in power, that Washington does not help Egypt, that Washington helps the Khoan now because they are in power, because it has its own interests with the Ikhwani regime due to Hamas and the relation, and if they want to control Hamas. What is wrong and what is right in that?
Well, let me say that I think this is a pretty profound misunderstanding of what governments do. We, of course, deal with the government. We have an enormous range of interests here, from agricultural sales to security sector reform to our enormous commercial interests. So of course we deal with ministries, we deal with the parliament, we deal with the Shura Council, we deal with the government that's in power because we have to. But this in no way should be interpreted as supporting one political power over another political power. That's not what we do.
So you're not supporting the Ikhwani regime because of the power over Hamas, because of the Gaza Pact, because of the delivering what you need within the settlement, within the Palestinian settlement?
But let me stress too that regional peace is hugely important to all of us. It's not just important to the United States, it's important to Egypt and its neighbors. We have excellent relations with the Egyptian military. We have excellent relationships with Egyptian intelligence, and we work with the government on these issues. Of course we do that. We're working with them on Syria. There's a lot of activity now on Syria, because that, of course, is an enormous challenge to this whole region. So we have security interests. Egypt has security interests, and of course we have to work with them on those issues.
But again, within that perception, there is also another perception that Washington was loud during the Mubarak's era, was loud whenever there is any violation of human rights, within any violation of Coptic rights. We do not hear the same loud voice of Washington when these violations are committed by the Khomeini regime.
I wasn't here during the Mubarak, but I rather doubt that's true. I think we've certainly,
I was there.
Yeah,
so I remember.
No, but we speak out. First of all, this is an elected government. Let's be clear about this. This is an elected government, as the Mubarak government was not elected. And there were certainly some, shall we say, egregious violations in terms of electoral practices under the previous regime. So this government is elected. But I think you have heard us speak out when they have violated what I would call international standards of human rights, because that's the key, the adherence to international standards.
We have not heard you speak out at the Constitutional Declaration. We have not heard you speak out at the Constitution. And I've heard some voices in Washington say now that maybe we have been too late. Maybe we have been too silent. Is this true?
Because those are issues for Egyptians to resolve. Ambassador Tawfiq in Washington would not go out and comment on the U.S. Constitution. The Egyptians have to resolve these issues through the political process. It's not for Americans to resolve, and it's not for us to comment on them endlessly.
But this is what you call American values, the freedom of the press, the women's freedom. I mean, these are the American values that you have been supporting.
The Secretary has spoken out in Alexandria, and other times she was here, on the rights for women, on the rights for Copts, or religious rights, the right to worship as you choose, essentially. So, but the issue is a political one, in that Egyptians are going to have to resolve these issues. It's not up to us to resolve them.
So when you say elected, you support any elected government, even if it turned to be a dictator?
We support a political process, a democratic political process. Egyptians are going to have to decide what that process is. These are elected government. You have to go through the political process, and ultimately the people have to speak by the ballot box. Transitions are hard in any country. This is a difficult transition. It was hard in Eastern Europe. It was hard in Latin America, hugely difficult in Latin America. And these are issues that the people of Egypt are just going to have to sort through.
The last statement of the State Department after the arrest of Ahmed Meher, one of the very well-known activists of 6th of April movement, said that this is a step back on democracy.
Yes,
How
of
do
course.
you see that?
We see it just as the State Department spokesperson said. Ahmed Meher is a well-known revolutionary activist. He had been in the States. He was arrested on what appear to be frivolous charges, and of course it's a step back, because you can't throw people in jail for their political beliefs.
Ambassador, on the freedom of the press, let me tell you something that I have been involved personally. The second siege of the media city. When the State Department in a press conference was asked about that, 2 days after the siege, they said, we do not have enough information. Who is responsible to give the State Department enough information?
What I think we said, and perhaps belatedly, is that security and the treatment of demonstrators, the law has to be applied equitably. It has to be applied in Media City. It has to be applied in front of the Semiramis Hotel. And I think we've spoken out a lot on issues of the press, particularly the harassment of the press through what I would call frivolous lawsuits, which have become fairly endemic in this society.
Yes, but you've started speaking about that only after the Jon Stewart episode on Bassem Youssef. Before that, the voice of Washington was so low and it cannot be heard.
That we have spoken out a lot on freedom of the press. I have a statement from our spokesperson on the issue on Media City, again, that the law has to be applied equitably. They have to control demonstrators at Media City, they have to control them in front of the Semiramis, and they have to control them in other parts of towns. So yes, I think we have spoken out on that, and freedom of the press is a big issue here, of course. But there are many people like yourself and many other journalists who speak freely, who I suspect are harassed by these lawsuits.
We are.
Yes. And we have certainly called on if they can't do anything about it, to denounce these lawsuits as frivolous.
On the Jon Stewart issue, why did you take off the video from the Twitter?
Because Jon Stewart's not a spokesman for the U.S. government. We certainly concur in what Jon Stewart said. He is extremely amusing. I watch him 2 or 3 times a week, but he doesn't speak for the U.S. government. And the U.S. government website should have U.S. government information on it.
Did you do that after the complaint of the Egyptian presidency?
We don't talk about our discussions with the Egyptian government, but the answer to that is no, actually.
But that was told at the State Department briefing.
Well, let me just say that we dismantled that because it is not a U.S. government spokesperson.
At the briefing, and I have a text of that, they said that you apologized to the presidency on that tweet. Is this true?
No, it's not true.
Did they call you?
I don't want to get in. We talk about our statements all the time. They call us, we call them about our statements, and I don't want to get into our discussions with the government on this. But we have an active exchange on statements, as we have, frankly, did with the SCAF. Sometimes they don't like what we say. Sometimes they do like what we say. Sometimes they think our nuance is wrong. This goes back and forth. And sometimes we don't like what they say, and we let them know.
Do you consider Jon Stewart as a program like what, I mean, the خوان described him, وحرية وعدالة described him as a negative political propaganda. Do you consider Jon Stewart negative?
I thought the Jon Stewart program was great. As a person, as an American citizen who watched Jon Stewart, I thought he did a great job. And I thought he pointed out sort of the unfortunate nature of this, but he still doesn't speak for the U.S. government. He is not a U.S. government spokesperson, and the U.S. government doesn't rely on TV personalities to speak on their behalf. We speak on our own behalf.
Why did you bring the whole feed down?
Well, that was frankly a mistake. But it was up again in a couple hours.
Because I remember also at the State Department briefing, they said that this does not apply with the department's policies.
Yes, and that was just a mistake.
فاصل آخر ونواصل حوارنا مع السفيرة الأمريكية عند باترسون.